Tailworlds Entertainment was founded by Armagan Yavuz, who studied computer engineering at Bill Kent University. The company, formed after members of the gaming community provided support to his hobby project, a project that went by the name Mount and Blade. At the time, it was still in its beta versions, but the company started to sell these e-copies of the beta version of the game online. Thus, funding started and the development ramped up. The series actually itself started with a game called Warrider, really what Mount and Blade was called before it was called Mount and Blade. It was a back-to-bones basic title inspired by the likes of Sid Meier's Pirates, The Elder Scrolls Daggerfall, and many others. Warrider itself was, well, you can see. There was very little in terms of polished gameplay, but the ideas were forming. A completely different map to the later Mount and Blade Warrider games that we had, and it only had a few different troop types. Along with the basic bare bones gameplay, there were some big issues. I mean, for starters, basic things like interacting with characters could crash the game, but hey, it was the start of something big. But this is where it started to get somewhat insane. Warrider was similar, but it had a lot of differences. It was much more of a solo story-driven title than the open-world RPG of Warband and Bannerlord we know today. Fantastical items of power were included, hidden locations, ghouls and monsters. I mean, the plot itself talks about the arrival of the undead. These are all things that were actually meant to be within the next version, Mount and Blade, but were taken out for a more historical approach, which I think was probably the best idea. Delving into the files actually of later games in the Mount and Blade series, you can see the remnants of the undead and the Black Knight armor used within the Warrider story. The Black Knight armor, by the way, many Mount and Blade fans might know as admin armor from Mount and Blade Warband's multiplayer servers. That's where it came from. It came from the first iterations of Mount and Blade. But what were the actual similarities and differences between this Warrider version and what came later? Well, as mentioned, it only had two factions, the Swadians and the Vaegirs. The Vaegirs revolted against the strong powers that the Swadians ruled with their mighty mounted knights. Then the eventual looming scare of the undead army that were on their way. Yet the game only had basic battles and commands. There were no sieges, not even castles or lords moving around. Any interactions with the NPCs had to just be done through menus by going into certain towns. Oh, and you could also slaughter your own horses if your party got really hungry. Why they took that out, I don't know. Maybe it was just weak. Maybe Tailworlds are just weak and they don't want killing horses. Give me my lasagna. Okay, actually, it's probably best they took that out. Yet despite Warrider's massive issues, there was a lot of personality there. Stupid things from the terrible facial animations to the Comic Sans text and font on everything. No matter how buggy and janky it was, there was an indication of much bigger things to come. The name was soon changed to Mount and Blade to better explain the actual contents of the game. Thus, development began and it changed from a demo alpha version to a full actual title. The community, despite this, had been growing and growing with early access looks at the basic mechanics, and Tailworlds eventually got a publishing partnership with Paradox themselves. Yes, the same guys that did Hearts of Iron and Crusader Kings. Paradox saw the growing success of this game and thought that they wanted some part of it. And then a release date was set. After a number of later alpha versions, Mount and Blade was fully released on September 2008, a complete and full overhaul of what Warrider had initially started. Camaraderie had been fully realized and the factions were starting to take shape. The fantasy elements were all but taken out of the game, which I can't speak for everybody, but I do think that was a decent idea. Historical focus is definitely something of a drawing point for the series these days, and especially early on, I feel like a fantasy game would have just been drowned out by the saturated pool of fantasy games back in the day. The factions now added in to Mount and Blade were the Nords, the Swadians, the Vaegirs, the Rhodoks, and the Kurgit Khane, all with their own unique units and playing styles. Yet the Saronids were missing. Yep, the southern faction actually only appeared later on in Warband. Not only this extra faction was missing, but the original Mount and Blade lacked many of the wider troop trees and a lot of detail when it came to diplomacy. I've played the original Mount and Blade for quite a lot. Granted, not as much as Warband, but even going back to it these days, it really does feel like it's aged quite a bit. Don't get me wrong, the core base of the title is still there. You can still definitely feel like a Mount and Blade game, but just small things. The neon green text over your troops. It looks looks so cluttered and so tacky. Even just the animations of charging up your sword or your lance when you're going into battle, it feels very clunky, and you can tell that they didn't have proper animators at the time. This was later confirmed that only proper animations were put in with Warband, and they just had to bear with what they could physically animate themselves for the original. The lack of the Saronid factions means the map's pretty small, and also battles feel kind of uninteresting. Look, it was cool at the time in 2008 when it came out, but the original Mount and Blade has been improved upon so much that I still feel to this day there isn't all that much need going back to it other than just nostalgia.
In the original Mount and Blade, the battles themselves feel very different. I've already spoken about the lack of good animations, but also the scale really makes a big difference when you actually try to immerse yourself within the battles. 2008's Mount and Blade saw the introduction of custom battles, whether you wanted to set up a skirmish, sieges, attacking and defending, different scenarios that you could get the hang of how these big battles and commanding troops worked. But with the lack of troops on the battlefield at a max up to 100, they do feel really small. I mean, look at this siege, for example. It feels like a tiny skirmish with only 50 men on each side. Of course, as soon as they start dying, it then looks like you've got a small rabble having a fist fight with a massive castle as the setting. It doesn't quite fit with that medieval battle simulator that I think a lot of people hoped for at the time. A criticism? Maybe. But can it be helped? Probably not. This was a tiny indie game at this point in time, made by only a few people. Remember, the original Mount and Blade didn't have the backing of Warband or especially Bannerlord, so there were so many limitations. The AI is far less advanced. I'm not really saying that the AI has gotten very good in later games, but it was particularly bad in the original Mount and Blade. People standing there not really knowing what they're doing. They're still defending the breaches and the holes in the walls, but they often get stuck on each other. Archers sometimes not go for a bit of wall that they can actually shoot out of, and most enemies or allies will just stand there. And battles between them look like a slapping contest between two disabled frogs. The textures are rubbish. The game looks terrible in the most charming of ways. Don't think anybody expected AAA graphics. I mean, it's a 2008 game, and well, if we compare it to the other 2008 games, it still doesn't look great. Mount and Blade Warband had that same issue. Many of the textures were reused for that game, and that just came down to the lack of budget in these titles, but it almost feels charming now, and it adds to that smell. You know, that old game nostalgia that wouldn't have that same feeling if it didn't look, feel or play like it did, even if it was really clunky and terrible, not just for today's standards but even back then. But there was something else that made this original Mount and Blade very special, that caught people's attentions and kept them coming back. The game at the time was only 32-bit, so it's kind of self-explanatory why it looked like this. There's very little in terms of real video options to crank up your graphics. Even playing at 4K, there's not all that much you can do to savor this. You see a lot of the same armor and weapons that were used later on in Mount and Blade Warband, but there were a lot that were taken out. And can I just say, the ones that were used in the original Mount and Blade that were taken out for Warband, you can see why. They are the weakest of textures and the weakest of armors in terms of how they look. The feel of playing characters is good, but it doesn't have that same feeling that Warband has. Maybe that's just down to the animations, but it definitely feels much clunkier and feeling like you have less control of these weapons. When you're using a sword, an axe, a shield, it feels like you're using a paperweight instead. You have your directional combat up, down, left, right, but all of it just looks weird and none of it gives you the possibilities for some cool moves, chambering, slicing, blocking like Warband had. I think it is just down to the weird feeling and clunky animations and the lack of that slick combat that we got later on. But the whole point of Mount and Blade's combat, or at least what it became, was to be able to tell what direction your enemy was attacking from and then block accordingly. That's not as easy in the original Mount and Blade going back to it now. It is possible, but you can't quite tell because of the animations which way they're going. This whole combat mechanic also comes back to difficulty settings. The original Mount and Blade had a lot less in terms of changing the difficulty, meaning that the game as a whole is so much easier than Warband ever was. It was later addressed with adding difficulty settings for recruitment, fighting, persuasion, combat, archery, so on and so forth, but that wasn't a massive point in the original Mount and Blade. So I can imagine back in the day when nobody had experienced a combat system like the thing that Tale Wars were presenting them, it could be incredibly confusing. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is a tutorial for Mount and Blade, but it's bare bones to say the least. Consisting of basic movement and weapon selection, fighting with a shield or fighting without a shield, even riding on horseback. Yet actually entering these tutorials doesn't give you all that much to go on. I mean, the one where you fight with a shield, you're equipped with nothing but a fists and a kite shield, and you had to stand there holding right click for 30 seconds. It's not exactly teaching you all that much. Moving on to the original map, most of it looks familiar, but is very different to what we saw later on. Especially if you played Warband, everything just seems to be in the wrong place. Sargoth, which of course is where the Nords live, is yellow, and is in a similar location to Warband, but not quite. Swadia's territory is pretty similar, but the Rhodoks are a light blue, and the Vaegirs are a green. The Khuzaits are in the right place, kind of, but spilling into the south of where the Sarranids would next be. Yet the rest of the game set the pinpoint for what this franchise would be. Recruiting soldiers, talking to the village elders for tasks, going on quests. And whilst the later games like Warband really didn't have much of a story, this one had even less. There wasn't a starting prologue or anything of the like. It just thrust you into the game, this sandbox world, and trusted that you'd be okay. And whilst it's charming now, I can imagine it being very infuriating back in the day. Maybe even putting people off the title. So it was time for something else, for something a little bit more mainstream.
But after the success of the classic Mount and Blade, Tale Wars had the community and the backing of Paradox to now expand the series. The next game, though, wouldn't necessarily be a sequel, not a Mount and Blade 2. It would actually just be a standalone expansion, and this was called Mount and Blade Warband. It was released in 2010, and the first noticeable change was the introduction of that sixth faction, the Sarranid Sultanate, a southern-based Dornish-like faction with a thing for heavy cavalry and Mamluks. Elite archers were a bit of a threat and a lot of toothpicks to throw at their foes. They can often be deadly when used by the player, but also a lot of fun to train up your peasants on when they're being controlled by the AI. Mount and Blade Warband's single player advanced on pretty much everything. It added in a completely new opening and prologue, some tutorial missions, and of course bigger quests in the general. Not only this, but it added way more in terms of gaining money, pillaging, looting, of course farming, herding cattle, everybody's favorite side quests, and bigger armies, now up to 150 troops on the battlefield at once. Sieges felt much smoother with more siege weaponry and siege engines, and of course the bigger factions and the bigger faction troop trees gave for much more variation when it came to recruiting. Yes, you could play with one faction. Maybe you just want a faction of Nords. That was definitely possible, but the mixing and matching of having the best from every aspect, having infantry from the Nords, having archers from the Vaegirs, having cavalry from the Swadians and crossbows from the Rhodoks, even horse archers from the Kyrgyz if that was more your thing.
The music of Mount and Blade Warband itself is iconic. I mean, if we're going to talk about game soundtracks, at least for me in my childhood, there's always a few that take you back to your favourite moments of history. Mount and Blade Warband is up there with Age of Empires 2 and Rome Total War, with a game soundtrack that makes you feel nostalgic without even having to see the game itself. Starting a new campaign in Warband is almost identical to the original. You choose where your parents are from and customize your character to fit, whether it's getting a beautiful mustache or randomizing because you are too lazy to do anything else. Of course, allow me to quit without saving, just in case we get into trouble. As mentioned, Mount and Blade Warband starts with a completely new prologue that was never in the original. Having a crossbow to headshot the first looter is always very satisfying, as they're definitely not going to put anything like a fight. Then you meet the merchant. He tells you that his brother is in terrible danger. He needs to see him and he'll give you so much money to try and find him. But of course you'd ignore him because we don't need any of that. As mentioned, the map has massively improved. The Rhodoks are now down in the south, near the new faction of the Sarranids, with the Kyrgyz Khanate on the right, the Vaegirs at the top, and the Nordics as well. As a side note, my dictation app that I use for taking notes interpreted me saying Vegirs as bagels. I don't know if that means anything to you. Wandering around, recruiting at the start of the game is one of the most satisfying things, slowly building up your army. You have very little in terms of money or clothes on your back, nothing to your name and a whole world ahead of you. The whole game of Mount & Blade is set at building your renown and building your army. You do this by recruiting troops in different villages, and depending on what the faction is that own the village, depends on the type of troops you can get. For me, it was always Swadia that I started with, slowly building up, and that first battle that you have with the looters is always playing out the same. Fighting at the front line on your horse, trying to get them to throw their stones at you, because if any hit your men, it feels like a dagger in your back. Any one man that goes down at this point is a dastardly setback in your world domination plans, and it always turned out that way. The early Mount & Blade game feels so perfected. You're always on a knife's edge, one loss away from losing everything, being captured by the bandits and having to start all over again. You're not a king here, you're not even a count, you have nothing to your name, so you have to be very careful at the battles you take and the armies you build up. Trying to span out how you build this army, you need enough money and food in order to keep them going, or they'll start to leave. Food is even a micromanaging game in itself. Grain is fantastic, but people get bored of it. The more variation you have of grapes, meat, wine makes your army have better morale in the long run. But if you have too much meat, it will start to rot and then the morale will drop. It's always a time-tested dynamic mechanic. Upgrading your first recruits to militia is so satisfying, seeing the new skills and weapons that they come out with now. Going to a training ground in order to upgrade your troops faster. You can spar with them over and over again, giving them more XP every time. Maybe you want to spar with your recruit because they have no skills at this point in time. You can do that. Maybe spar with a recruit, a knight or a footman. You can do that. It's a fast way to level up your troops, but you also need to make sure that you have the skills in order to beat them in battle, or very little XP will be gained. Spending 10 to 15 minutes on a training camp can be the difference between an army of recruit and militia to your first footman or even a man-at-arms. The best ways to make money early game were doing quests or trading, fighting in tournaments, but of course that meant you had to be handy with a sword yourself, even holding up caravans that had dyes or expensive silks on them. If you had an army to take them on, they could be the perfect treasure trove, to later on pillaging and plundering villages to get the true loot. Heading up north to fight sea raiders gave you great rewards of chainmail and great axes, but they were harder than your regular looters. Then, seeing your first man-at-arms ride onto battle after being recruited from just small militia was the shining prowess of any Swadian player's dreams. It seems like a scummy tactic at this point, but I always loved playing of an army of Swadian knights. They're so powerful. Some would say too powerful, being able to swarm over pretty much any enemy, whether it's a caravan, a full army, or even sieging a castle. They would hop off horseback and fight hand to hand. Cavalry was so overpowered in Mount & Blade. Not necessarily all that fair, but boy was it still fun. Then, taking over your first castle was when the game really started to span out. Adventuring on your own across the lands was fun, but when you finally conquered a castle and you get to keep it from yourself, creating a name for your new kingdom and seeing the future that was to behold was when Mount & Blade came into its own. Getting a wife to look after the castle, garrisoning the walls. If you're sieged, you have to fight on the defensive side this time, making sure they have enough food and money in order to keep running. Having fiefs and villages, upgrading them to then bring in taxes of their own, made this RPG adventurer into almost a kingdom management simulator. There were so many different phases to Mount & Blade Warband that made it so special at the time. This game could get incredibly big, incredibly fast.
I played so many hours on this, and to this day have over 1,500 hours on Mount & Blade Warband. It is still my most played game. I sunk so many hours into the single player, and that was just the native. That's not even talking about modding. Modding in general grew and grew with Warband. With basic but useful modding tools, there was still a community of developers that decided they wanted to change the game. It started with basic reskins and some mechanical changes, but then we started to get the overhauls. Warsword Conquest that added in Warhammer to the game. Floris Expanded that took the native, added in more factions, troops, armors, and completely new mechanics.
My favourites that I absolutely adored were the examples of Bellum Imperii, Imperial Roman Overhaul, that added in in some beautiful models, and we'd actually see them come on later with their multiplayer counterpart mods. Modding in general in Warband was something that we'd never really seen before. The Elder Scrolls games were perhaps before this the best known games for massive modding communities, but Mount & Blade sort of took it over, and even not being the biggest game in the world by a long shot, had a community that rivaled even AAA titles. Whether it was overhauls, small patches or updates, Warband was the king of its overhauls. I could count over 100 that I just played myself, and I didn't even slightly delve into some of the depths. So let me know down below what your favourite overhaul for Mount & Blade Warband was. Mount & Blade Warband's release in 2010 not only advanced the single player to no end, but it also added in a new multiplayer variant. And this is where the Mount & Blade series really started to gain some traction in the wider world. The multiplayer itself started off as something rather unspectacular, but it had one unique selling point: the sheer scale. You see, Mount & Blade had now built up a community of players that were used to siege battles and large-scale field attacks with up to 150 AI soldiers on the battlefield at once. But this was the single player. So when it was translated to multiplayer, not only did it have that same scale, but it actually eventually became even bigger, eventually moving to 200 and 250 players all in one server, fighting in these multiplayer battles and sieges. This had never been done before in gaming, and I remember it blowing me away, and this is how Mount & Blade started to really gain its name. In 2010, the Mount & Musket mod was released. It brought the native warband experience into a new era, the Napoleonic Wars. Because of the massive historical fans within the franchise, this new Napoleonic Wars style of fighting gave way to the natural forming of lines within players. Cannons would be introduced and full-scale battles went underway. Naturally, the community started to form regiments, with the French, the British, and the Russians, and it gave way to these massive-scale clan battles. They would meet up weekly and reenact the battles of old, fighting in lines or in sieges. Before long, footage of these private events would be uploaded to the internet, and because of this, more and more people started to flood into the title. Not too long after, because of the growing community, a new sequel was in the works. Well, I say sequel. It's more like another standalone expansion. This time, however, we're taking the franchise to a whole new era. On the 4th of May 2011, we got Mount & Blade with Fire and Sword. With Fire and Sword was based on the historical fictional novel with the same name by Polish author Henryk Sienkiewicz. It was set during the 17th century Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and my god, did it bring in something new. The standalone expansion could be, as the name suggests, played without owning the Mount & Blade games before, opening up to a completely new fanbase. It brought in new mechanics in the form of gunpowder weaponry, with 5 new factions: the Kingdom of Sweden, Cossack Hetmanate, Polish Commonwealth, Muscovite Sardon, and the Crimean Khanate. There was so much new content for players to explore, from the infamous winged hussars to elite marksmen and musket troops. Unlike much of what we got in Warband before, however, the single player for With Fire and Sword was much more along its own campaign storyline, with quests for 3 of the 5 factions to follow, characters to meet and battles to win. One of my personal favourite features is this inclusion and the time period and the effects that it had on the gameplay. As, yeah, muskets and gunpowder were used on the field, but they were still incredibly inaccurate and unreliable at the time, meaning that the age of sword and bow was definitely not over. This gave an amazing cross-section and look into history. The variety of weapons to use was bigger than any game we'd had before. Gunpowder versus the ancient times, and my god was it a sight to see on the battlefield. The use of grenades and firearms meant casualties were way higher on the field than any regular warband battle, and sieging castles was much, much harder. This meant Tailwords had to find new ways of capturing forts, like blowing holes in walls, bribing guards, or even poisoning the water supply to drag out the defenders. Despite its success, however, there were a couple of things with this expansion that I personally wasn't too much of a fan of. I mean, for example, troop trees were all but gone, instead opting for a veteran system. You would recruit faction troops as usual, but then only really get one chance to upgrade them to their final form. This put much more use into the mercenaries, who would get these upgrade option and trees, and sometimes even the chance to customize said mercenaries by visiting their camps. Fire and Sword also had multiplayer, but it never really took off in the same way. It's something to be said that the expansion was well received. I mean, people still seem to really like it, but it didn't quite have the same staying power that Warband ended up having. Yet Tailwords were not done yet.
on the 19th of April 2012, they brought out perhaps the most game-changing of Mount & Blade's updates to date, Napoleonic Wars. Unlike with Fire and Sword, this DLC was, well, a DLC. It wasn't a standalone expansion, so you had to own Mount & Blade Warband in the first place. But remember when I said that modding tools is one of the things that changed Mount & Blade forever? Well, this is the later effect of that. You see, Napoleonic Wars as a DLC was actually developed and based off the Mount and Musket mod for Mount & Blade Warband, the mod that brought people into the Napoleonic Wars. Instead, they just decided to put some budget behind it and sell it as a premium piece of work. And it was just that. Animations were much better, sound design was incredible, so much in terms of new assets and of course maps were added into the game. The DLC was multiplayer only, which might have put some people off, but this really didn't stop the content from coming in. There was a lot to get your hands on with the NW DLC. It upped from 200 to 250 players in the same multiplayer servers, 220 unique units within the game, from cavalry to artillery, engineers and rocket troops. It took away the customization of picking your armor before a multiplayer map that Warband had and went with these set troop types. This meant it could be more historically accurate to the Napoleonic Wars at the time, whether you were playing as the British, the French, the Russians, the Prussians, later on with new factions coming in as well, each with their own foot guards, riflemen, light infantry, having their own uniforms and set subclasses, whether you were playing as the fifer or the drummer, even a bagpipe player as the Scottish Highlanders, playing as an officer with a spyglass to lead your troops into the battle, a musketman fixing bayonets and charging through the breaches. Speaking of breaching, they actually added in fully destructible terrain as well. With the introduction of artillery, it meant for the opportunities to see the consequences of those big balls of lead. Being able to knock breaches and fort walls, knock down doors, and destroy ships. Yes, later introduced to the update were ships as well, full of navy and marine classes, meant for these amazing battles of attacking forts not just from land but also from the oceans as well. People sailing around using the cannons on board, boarding other ships, and my god was it an incredible experience. Speaking of an incredible experience, a new soundtrack was added in using an array of 50 different pieces of music from classical to custom, and it fit perfectly for the time period. You really felt that you were in this symphony of destruction within the bloody battles in the Napoleonic Wars. Whether it was line battles or sieges, there was so much fun to be had, especially on the custom private events. You see, when you have such a big multiplayer community that Mount & Blade Napoleonic Wars started to grow, you will also have some knock-on effects as people start to come together. You know, reenactors that get together every now and then and try and reenact these famous battles from history in real life. Well, players in Mount & Blade thought, why can't we do that within the game? Lining up in their own regiments, historically accurate to the time period, the British, the French, sieging forts, playing line battles with set rules and itineraries, going to certain events at certain times, having training maps where they practice their melee weaponry, their cannon firing or their horseback combat, and then taking that into the big events with up to 250 players all in other regiments of their own. Whether you played as a footman regiment, whether you played as a light infantry, a rifleman, an artillery, even a naval regiment, they were all within it. Having engineers placing down barricades and digging trenches in order for their other regimental lads to use. Later on, an update came out adding in medics for Napoleonic Wars, meaning that you could have someone following around your line, healing troops as they go. It was so in-depth and it was so passionately devoted to by its fanbase. So even now, 10 years later, Mount & Blade Napoleonic Wars still has these multiplayer events. It even inspired games like Hold Fast Nations at War and Battle Cry of Freedom. The effects that this DLC had within the gaming industry in general are rippled throughout the last decade. But Taleworlds was still not done yet, because in December of 2014, we got another DLC. This one once again based off a mod from before, Brightonwalder. This was Viking Conquest. Developed by the people behind Brightonwalder, it was a massive advancement for storytelling within the franchise. Viking Conquest took players into the dark age of Northern Europe, the 9th century, where Norsemen invaded the British Isles and took a complete headspin on what fans had come to expect from the Mount & Blade franchise. The DLC added in 6 historically accurate cultures and 21 corresponding factions, with their own unique feel and troops. Not only this, but the start itself took the sandbox and implemented the possibility for a now story-driven campaign. Starting up, it lets you choose between this narrative story-driven campaign or your regular Mount and Blade sandbox, starting at different levels from regular to Lord or even King. However, the first thing you really notice with this DLC is the menu music. Oh my god, does it set the scene. This was going to be a new take on Mount and Blade games, and they really tried to show that from the get-go. The DLC does have multiplayer, but much like Queen Elizabeth II, it's dead. Completely. Sandbox is pretty much what you'd expect from Mount and Blade, but basically just set within a Viking world with a few tweaks here and there. The map is of course custom made, the United Kingdom, with warring factions to explore. Starting as a king in sandbox mode, however, essentially just means you get a massive head start, loads of XP to distribute, and an army to fit. You can go straight into battles destroying your enemies. None of this adventure and nonsense. A big change actually is the general aesthetic to Viking Conquest. I don't know exactly what they've done, but it feels a little bit more dirty and grimy, or at least compared to what native Warband had. Of course, the team had to work with what the Tailworld original gave them, you know, that pretty old and knackered engine, but it seems like their attempts to improve the game graphically works in some places, but in my humble opinion, not in others. Things like the water looks a lot nicer now, don't get me wrong. I mean, it kind of needs to for an expansion whose main feature is ship battles, but the general vibe kind of feels a little bit off to me. Maybe that's just because I'm so used to how muted the vanilla Mount and Blade looks, but in my opinion, I'm not a massive fan of the general feel of this DLC. Viking Conquest has a lot more customization than what vanilla had though. You can ramp up the battle sizes all the way to 750 agents, which is way more than Warband ever had. This makes for some incredibly immersive battles with shield wars and other new troop types like slingers. Oh, and you can actually form proper shield wars now. Warband didn't really have that feature, so it kind of made sense for them to add it in with Viking Conquest, along with many more advanced formations that really gives you that epic Viking feel. Troops with spears and shields will now war cry and slam their weapons into the shields to intimidate the enemy beyond. Combat in general is similar, of course. It's still Mount and Blade, but with a few extra added things like shield bashing, which stuns the enemy, and critical hit points. Hitting someone else, or in my case, being hit from behind, will deal extra damage, which can be absolutely brutal if you're not ready for it. However, additions like this are what Mount and Blade really needed, adding a little bit more realism and forcing players to stick with their troops more, form shield wars and fight in formation rather than the usual F1, F3 charge. As entertaining as it is, it didn't exactly recreate medieval battles as most people expected them to. Villages and towns do also have a bit more added detail. Wandering around, NPCs will be doing their jobs in the farm and can be interacted with as usual. There's also children in the game. However, you can't kill them if that's what you're thinking. The DLC adds in locations of interest, not owned by anyone. These are just neutral places that you can go and explore. They add to this ever-changing story, and it kind of makes you feel a bit more like an adventurer than the native Mount and Blade ever did. Weapons also have modifiers to increase and improve them, meaning that sticking and working with one type of weapon is actually warranted here. You can create hideouts anywhere on the map with your party. You could go and walk around, and this is where you can train troops or keep troops occupied before a big invasion. And of course, the big one, naval battles. It was something very, very new. Of course, as mentioned, Viking Conquest was based off the Brighton Walder DLC, and that's when naval battles were really introduced, but they were kind of improved here. Being able to sail around and go into these scenes charging across the vessels. You could actually steer ships, and your troops would throw javelins and sling from the decks, and it was so satisfying, ramming into them and of course boarding the enemy vessel. It was a really cool addition, and of course the main selling point for a Viking based expansion. All in all, Viking Conquest was pretty successful. I think many people, or at least the single player fans, were really into this at the time. It was actually remastered just a couple years after its initial release, but then Tailworld decided to go a different direction. They thought console was the way. You see, after multiple DLCs and continued growing of the community, Tailworld saw that the Mount and Blade franchise was more than what it actually started off as. It was a kind of nerdy medieval RPG sandbox that was very much targeted towards a PC player base because there wasn't a mainstream audience here. But these DLCs, and especially Mount and Blade Warband's multiplayer, had grown the notoriety of this franchise to a point where they were starting to look elsewhere. In 2016, Mount & Blade Warband released onto Xbox One and PS4. It was pretty much exactly the base game, but with a few changes. Of course, complete console controls, which worked pretty well for what they could do, and multiplayer battles were 32 versus 32. What's the point of them then? Despite the lack of Mount & Blade's best features like custom servers, mods, and the DLC add-on, Mount & Blade still actually sold pretty well on both consoles, and it was a little taster to get people interested in this franchise. Of course, the addition going onto PS Now and of course Xbox Game Pass opened it up to a much bigger audience for this medieval epic to tap into. But that was seemingly it for Mount & Blade, or at least Mount & Blade Warband. That was kind of the end of its life. Tailwards were prepping for something much bigger, and it was about to enter the limelight after 8 years.
You see, back in 2012, we got the first real announcement that Bannerlord was being worked on, the sequel to Mount & Blade Warband, yet it's kind of more of a prequel lore-wise, heading back 200 years before the events that we found in our first outing of Calradia. Gone are the factions that we came to know and love in Warband. This was a time of a late empire, split into splintering factions, giving hints of her glory that once was. The Sturgians were in the north, the Rus of the Mount & Blade world. Vlandians had heavy cavalry to smash down their foes. The Khuzays, who were the ancestors of the later Khergit Khanate, rode on the steppes with bow and horse, and who could of course forget the Azerai, still very much like their later Saranid cousins, great for bullying and leveling up your troops on. Something definitely got to be running in their family. After the incredible success of Mount & Blade Warband with all its DLCs, Tailwards had gone solo. They left the warmth and safety that was Paradox as a publishing house and thought they could do it all in their own. And I guess they were right. Before we get into the game itself, it would be dishonest not to speak about the incredible delays of Bannerlord. The announcement, of course, as mentioned, came in 2012. It started that hype train, but that train kept missing stops, and it never wanted to slow down for 8 whole years. Reports of the game going back and forth in development, scrapping the project and starting again time and time over. How true these rumors are, I guess we will never really know, but creating a new game engine from scratch, which was what Tailwards were trying to do, completely different to what Warband had, was never going to be an easy feat. But every single Gamescom that Tailwards went to, 2017, 2018, 2019, each time they brought us more gameplay and more unfulfilled promises. And this is where the split from Paradox could have been detrimental. Yeah, it gives Tailwards all the freedom in the world. They can create whatever game they wanted to in whatever time frame they wish. They don't have the same budget perhaps, but they do have the fan base, so distribution wouldn't really be an issue. Yet having a powerhouse of a publishing company like Paradox above you can also have its advantages. Keeping development on track is one of them. Handling extra resources when needed to make sure release schedules are met and not letting deadlines slip. Would that have been detrimental to the creative process for Bannerlord? Maybe, but it definitely, without a doubt, would have helped Tailwards' PR, which admittedly wasn't great upon the lead-up. It got to the point where there were so many complaints to the dev team that they actually set up weekly developer blogs just to appease the angry fans who kept being teased to no avail. Did it work? Kind of. At least it gave me more videos. I mean, we can never forget that infamous Camel developer blog. Yes, all my hard work and years of building up a fan base that are interested in Mount & Blade led to that moment, sitting in my room, wondering, what am I doing? As I made an entire video on the fact that camels are going to be in the new game. If you remember that, you are a real one. It wasn't until 2018 at Gamescom that the first playable version of the title was shown to fans. Remember, by this time it had been 6 years since the initial announcement and 4 years since any screenshots or gameplay. Choosing which faction area you start off will give you some advantages depending on what troop and playstyle you're going for. The initial prologue has gone. No more fighting a bandit in the streets. But you will be introduced straight away to the new tutorial, or training camp as we should call it. I mean, sure, if it's your first time playing, it will go through some basics of the mechanics of the new sword fighting, or using your bow, or even riding a horse. But after you've done it once, you don't need to do this again. Just skip that bit. The map of Calradia does feel a similar scale to Warband's. As mentioned, it is still Calradia, but there's a few, well, shifts in the landscape in the last 200 years. There's some sort of Pangea effect has happened in the space of 200 years here. What is going on with this? Roaming around, though, the game gives you plenty of money-making opportunities straight off the bat. Unlike Warband, where at the beginning it was really just mostly efficient to attack looters and sell their gear, Bannerlord actually goes a little bit more realistic. If you want to make money, and I mean real money, enough to pay for a small warrior band, you better be doing quests from the start. Okay, look, you can still play a little bit like Warband, just fighting off bandits at the beginning and selling their gear and taking them prisoner, but it's not the real efficient way to play. Quests are pretty fun. I mean, they're a little bit hit and miss depending on which ones you choose. They're not exactly the most exciting, and some can get kind of repetitive, but they do at least pay well. Getting horses for people can do bits if the fives aren't too far away. Escorting caravan missions is a good amount of fun and it pays decent, not to mention the battle experience your troops get. However, one of the best is taking out bandit hideouts for certain town members. You get paid 3,000 dinars from a simple hideout attack, plus all the loot, prisoners, and XP you could ever want. This is one to look out for. Another great addition that Bannerlord adds over its 2010 counterpart is the fact that you can have NPCs doing certain quests and jobs for you. You know, the scrubs that you find in the taverns. Ask them to join your parties and they can be upgraded just like a regular player character, even given commands of troops on the battlefield or custom armor, normally your hand-me-downs. These NPCs can be chosen to escort a mission with sending a few troops with them, still bringing that cash in the later game without really having to do much of the work yourself. This also links into the new caravan system. Along with more of the RPG aspects of Mount and Blade 2 Bannerlord, buying up shops, workshops, smiths, or sending out caravans on their way is a great way to start stocking up money. Of course, make sure you give them enough guards because they will probably be attacked, but they can bring in a heavy flow of cash. Tournaments are also pretty good, and they've had a complete revamp in the new title. Being able to join in on any city's tournaments, if you see the little bronze helmet icon, this means that there is a tournament going on. You can place bets on yourself, fighting in various styles of tourney, from archery battles in the north to horseback bowmanship in the east, all relating to the faction that the town originates in. Not only can money be won, but arms and armor, or even sometimes expensive horses. A cool little side note with the tournaments is the fact that whilst you'll be fighting against some generic soldiers in here, sometimes NPCs, lords, and characters from your party or other parties in the town will be the ones taking part in the tournament as well, and you'll be fighting against them. It's a cool, nice little immersion touch and gets you seeing characters' faces over and over again and kind of working up that relationship with them. The game also adds in a load of little quality of life things in that Warband never had. From the aforementioned tourney icons, so you don't have to go into every town you find, being able to talk to NPCs from the town menus rather than having to run around the streets looking for them. Menus in general are much more flush and simple to read, giving a lot more information for a lot less space on the screen. Diplomacy screens, troop movements, your clan, and of course later your kingdom is beautifully set out and is really obvious for management of your playthrough. Bannerlord itself gives you full encyclopedias for every single faction, town, and troop within the game, all their stats, armor, and where they might be found. Marking up towns for missions or general exploration is incredibly easy, and the gameplay experience for Bannerlord in general is so much smoother and feels more premium than Warband ever was. But what about the core gameplay? Well, whilst Warband said on the surface that you could roleplay as pretty much whoever you wanted, the actual depth of each of these roles was kind of shallow. Yes, in Warband you could technically be a trader, but only by moving items from one place to another. In Bannerlord, you can actually buy workshops, create goods by crafting tools and weapons. You can then send out your caravans and NPC workers to trade for you, creating a full merchant network. In Warband, you could technically become a soldier in another army, but in Bannerlord, you could actually follow these lords, join them, and raise up the ranks by getting known by them and increasing your renown. Get personal orders by them on the battlefield or captain one of their detachments in the army. With the addition of some mods like Serve as a Soldier, you can even play as a lone front rank soldier, leveling up with new armor and weapons every time your AI lord upgrades you. An incredible piece of immersion. To add to this, Tales recently introduced a battle terrain system, a feature that breaks the overworld map up into tiny detailed sections to translate them onto the battle maps themselves. Armies will spawn in the correct direction that they were faced on the overworld map. Towns will appear in the background if you're fighting nearby. Bridges will be in the correct place as they were on the overworld map, so you can choose and plan bottlenecks and attacks. Every single update, it gets more and more detailed, and it is incredible. Hopefully in the future it will be on par with what we got in the original Rome Total War. Speaking of battle maps, this is where some of the big differences come in. Going back to Warband now, it makes it very painfully clear how much these maps and battle sizes have improved. From the 150 agents that Warband had to offer, now is boosted up to 1,000 troops on the battlefield at once, making for some incredibly awesome moments, especially with the more recent additions of battle deployment, being able to intricately split up units with different classes, from archers, infantry, cavalry, so on and so forth. Then you can even prioritize them with heavy armored units or light armored units in a certain section. Then selecting an NPC that you've recruited before to lead that unit will free you up on the battlefield to do more fighting rather than commanding. These NPCs can also be given banners with different buffs like better morale, arrow resistance, speed, and so on. Giving them to an NPC will show up in the unit that they command on the battlefield, giving them that buff, keeping it active as long as the troop that is holding the banner is still standing. It really feels now that we've finally reached that in-depth, immersive medieval battlefield experience that has been building for the last few years. This even moves to sieges. They've had so much of an improvement. Being able to surround a city, build siege engines to bombard whilst on the overworld map to try and take out the defenders' siege engines, or even make a breach in the wall, making it easier once you initiate the attacking phase. Or you can reserve these siege engines, use them in the battle themselves, an impressive sight admittedly, when trebuchets break down the crenellations of an enemy castle and men go flying. All this encompasses the scale which Tales have strived to create over the last few years. And whilst, yes, Bannerlord came into early access and it had some backlash, but with it, it actually gave the opportunity for development to continue and grow with the game itself. With the backing and live testing of the fans, they could play it whilst updates were coming out and give live feedback. And I think it has been incredibly successful for Bannerlord itself. Yet in this 2.5 years that Bannerlord has been out in early access, it still hasn't stopped modders from getting their hands on the game, even before official modding tools were widely available. I mean, there were even mods for the beta of Bannerlord before early access. Custom battles actually arrived in Bannerlord by mods when it was just a multiplayer testing phase. That's kind of incredible. Then we got things like Eagle Rising and Carradio Awakens being some of the first massive overhauls, the former being one of my favourite Roman expansions. The intricate details on the Lorica Segmentata brought me back to the days of the Bellum Imperii mod for Warband. Of course, many modifications are still in the early days and nowhere near finished. Eagle Rising, for example, has Romans, Carthage, and a barbarian faction or two, but soon it will be translated onto a new custom map based on Europe itself. This map already looks insane, by the way, adding in things like sea travel and so much more to come. Separatist Crisis is the Star Wars Conquest mod for Bannerlord. Do I need to explain what's going on in this mod? Look, it's Star Wars in Mount and Blade. They're planning on having full planets that can be moved between on the campaign map, recruiting soldiers from every star system with all their different unique troops and troop trees that you'd expect from the Star Wars universe, being able to upgrade and make ships, space battles. I cannot wait for this, and that's not even including the possibility of them adding in co-op with the campaign later on. Tailworlds were not a silent helper here either. They very much saw the big impact that the modding scene had on Warband and arguably made it the game it is today. Therefore, the developers actively encouraged the same to come to Bannerlord, not only adding in modding tools, but speaking with Bannerlord's mod devs and the community themselves, adding in more in-depth modding tools, making it easier to rig new troops and add assets. Warband had a basic map maker, but Bannerlord has it inbuilt into the game itself. No moving around files and almost breaking your game in the process. Full intricate tools, forming terrain, buildings, even importing your own textures and assets to any map built within Bannerlord. This has meant that in such a short space of time, Mount and Blade 2's modding community has thrived. The 11th most modded game on Nexus? Yeah, how about that? Even recently, Steam Workshop has released And whilst bare bones right now in terms of variation, slowly but surely, mods from Nexus are being imported over to make it increasingly easier for players to download their favourite overhauls and modifications. This isn't even introducing with what's next. We've had a lot of single player mods, and there are so many more to come. Kingdoms of Arda, Lands of Sikaar, the old realms being improved over and over again. But now multiplayer has full custom servers. Remember those massive line battles we spoke about in Warband? Well, they're starting to prop up in Bannerlord now, and it's not the same this time. This time around, with the massive improvement with the server support and the way Bannerlord functions, we've gone from 250 players on a server to 400, 500. There was even a 1,000 player test the other night for multiplayer servers. And as far as Tailwoods are aware, they've said, look, you can do it, but we wouldn't recommend it. But you can tell that modders and people are just going to try and push these events as big as possible. Not only have we had native line battles now, but the sword and musket mod, the Napoleonic Wars iteration, is up and running. Regiments are starting to form and line battles have been made. Full Invasion 3 is on its way. The sequel to Mount & Blade Warband's horde-based co-op game, where you'd have hordes of Lord of the Rings, World War II soldiers, even My Little Ponies charging at you as you'd fight anywhere from Helm's Deep to under the ocean. It was one of the biggest mods, and it was goddamn incredible. That's coming to Bannerlord. And of course, Persistent World, the full multiplayer open world, playing as a serf to a knight to a king, joining up with other factions and going to war. That is now in development. This really is a future that I cannot wait to see. So then, that begs the question, where do we go now? Is this it? Well, maybe it is. I think it could just be. I mean, the game is here, is out. The full release of Mount & Blade 2 Bannerlord, not only on PC but on consoles as well. Of course, the game will continue to grow with a community that is coming in at a better time than any. Mods are still growing and being developed, and they will continue to release. This is a community that will never stop building. Yet from a Tailwoods perspective, from a developer point of view, whilst fixing bugs and small issues will continue to happen throughout the full release, in terms of content, I think it's really going to slow down. There may be bits and pieces here, but I don't really see any massive changes coming in the future. DLCs? Maybe. Tailwoods stated in the release plan, while they don't have any real intentions for DLCs right now, probably because they're still working on the full release update, it's something that could definitely happen in the future, and I think quite likely. We saw it with Warband, multiplayer DLCs based off mods, and I can't see why Tailwoods wouldn't do the same now. I'd love to see another Napoleonic Wars DLC, but at the same time, I'm not sure if retreading those same steps is all that a good idea. Maybe they should take it somewhere completely different. Still keeping it within the Bannerlord limits, but something that players had never seen before.